Welcome, everyone, to another deep dive. And today we're tackling a case that's really both perplexing and honestly kind of chilling.
Yeah, it's
the Hinterkaifeck Farm Murders.
It's one of those cases that kind of sticks with you.
Yeah.
Even after you've kind of put the research down.
Absolutely. And we're going to be diving into this case using some books and documentaries and some articles. And just to set the scene, we're traveling back to 1922 Bavaria. So a time and place that already feels a bit uneasy just months after the First World War.
Yeah, kind of that post-war period where things are still a little unsettled.
Right, exactly.
And I think what adds to the unsettling feeling of this case is the location we're dealing with here. It's a very isolated landscape.
Yeah, you've got these rolling hills and these dense woods.
Right.
And then kind of nestled in this landscape is Hinterkaifeck Farm. And this is home to the Gruber family.
And that isolation is key here. It wasn't just geographical, it was a way of life.
Right.
No phones, no cars. Your nearest neighbor is miles away.
Right.
It creates this unique vulnerability. Almost like a character in the story itself.
Right. And into this isolated world walks the Gruber family. We've got Andreas and Cecilia, an elderly couple, their widowed daughter Victoria with her two young children, 7-year-old Cecilia, and little Joseph, who was only 2.
Right, and then you throw in Maria Baumgartner, the new maid, just days into her new job.
Yeah.
6 people living and working on this remote farm.
Yeah, just 6. And then in the spring of 1922, they vanished.
Well, not all at once, of course.
Right.
And I think that's what makes the story so eerie, is that there were these signs, these whispers of something not quite right in the weeks leading up to their disappearance.
Yeah, like what kind of signs are we talking about?
Well, Andreas, the father, he told neighbors about finding these footprints in the snow.
Footprints?
Yeah, around the house.
Okay.
Footprints that didn't belong to anyone he knew.
Okay, that's strange.
Yeah, and he claimed to hear noises coming from the attic, like someone was living up there.
Hold on, someone's secretly living in the attic.
Yeah.
Okay, that's already giving me the creeps.
Yeah.
I mean, could this have been a simple break-in gone wrong, or was there something more, I don't know, sinister at play?
Well, if it was a break-in, it was a weird one because nothing was reported stolen from the farm.
Okay.
And those strange occurrences, the footprints, the noises, it suggests something a little more deliberate, more calculated.
Yeah.
It's almost like someone was watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike.
So what happened next? The family just disappeared.
Well, for several days, there was just silence.
Silence.
Yeah, the maid didn't show up for work in the nearby village. The children were missing from school.
Wow.
No one saw or heard from any of the Grubers.
Okay.
Finally, on April 4th, 1922, concerned neighbors decided to investigate.
Yeah.
What they discovered at the farm was a scene of unimaginable horror.
So this is where our deep dive takes a really dark turn. We're talking about a pretty brutal crime scene, right?
Absolutely. The bodies of all 6 family members and the maid were found scattered throughout the farm.
Wow.
Some in the house, some hidden in the barn.
Oh my gosh.
They'd all been brutally murdered, bludgeoned to death with a mattock.
A mattock, just to paint a picture for our listeners, that's a heavy farming tool with a sharp blade on one side. You know, the kind used for breaking up soil.
Right. It's not a subtle weapon.
No, it's a chilling detail that speaks to the sheer brutality of this attack.
It does. And for the investigators, it added another layer of complexity to the case.
Right.
Remember, this is 1922.
Right.
Long before DNA analysis or any of the modern forensic techniques, they were working with limited resources, relying heavily on eyewitness accounts and basic observation.
I can only imagine the challenges they faced. I mean, we've all seen those old detective shows, right?
Right.
Fingerprinting was still in its infancy. Crime scene preservation was practically non-existent.
Exactly. And in a small, isolated community like that, where rumors and speculations spread like wildfire, separating fact from fiction.
Oh, yeah.
Must have been a nightmare.
Yeah.
And then you got to consider the remote location of the farm itself.
Right.
Getting in and out, bringing in equipment, securing the scene.
Right.
It would have been a logistical challenge even by today's standards.
Totally. Okay, so we've got this remote location, a brutal crime, and a police force that's equipped with pretty limited tools for investigation. But what about motive?
Yeah.
Why would someone target this family in such a savage way?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the sources we've compiled offer a fascinating, if frustrating, array of possible answers. The lack of any obvious theft ruled out robbery as a motive.
Right.
So who stood to gain from the Gruber family's demise?
Well, one of the first names that comes up is Carl Gabriel, Victoria's husband.
Right.
He was officially declared dead in World War I.
Mm-hmm.
like a lot of things in this case, there's a layer of uncertainty there.
Right. There were always these whispers in the community that Carl might have survived the war, you know?
Oh, really?
Could be living under an assumed identity.
Okay.
Maybe he even returned to the area seeking revenge or reclaiming what he felt was rightfully his.
Wow.
No, the sources say that he and Victoria had a somewhat tumultuous relationship before the war, so
Right.
who knows what might have been festering in his mind all those years?
Yeah.
Presuming he was indeed alive.
Okay, so we're already dealing with a potential ghost from the past that certainly adds intrigue. And it seems like Carl wasn't the only one with a possible connection to Victoria. What about Lorenz Schlittenbauer, her neighbor?
Yes, Schlittenbauer. He had a rather complicated relationship with Victoria.
Okay.
Some sources even suggest a romantic link between them, which would make his potential motive pretty clear.
Right.
However, the details are murky.
Okay.
His alibi for the time of the murders was shaky at best. And he changed his story about his whereabouts multiple times when questioned by the police.
Okay, so we've got a potentially jealous neighbor with a questionable alibi. It's definitely sounding like, a classic setup for a murder mystery. But the sources also mentioned a couple of other individuals, the Gumperger brothers, who used to work on the farm. What was their story?
The Gumperger brothers were former farmhands. They had left the Gruber's employ under somewhat acrimonious circumstances.
Okay.
There were rumors of unpaid wages, arguments, perhaps even threats exchanged.
Wow.
It's not hard to imagine them harboring some resentment towards Andreas and the family.
Right. So could this have been an act of revenge by disgruntled ex-employees? I mean, it's certainly possible, but what about those footprints that Andreas claimed to have found and the noises in the attic? Could there have been someone else entirely lurking on the property? Maybe someone with no direct connection to the family at all?
That's another chilling possibility we have to consider. Remember, post-war Germany was a tumultuous time.
Right.
There were displaced people, soldiers struggling to readjust to civilian life, some suffering from what we now understand to be post-traumatic stress disorder. Yeah, it's conceivable that someone, perhaps mentally unstable or desperate, might have sought shelter in the farm's abandoned attic, and who knows what their intentions might have been.
Yeah, you're painting a picture of a society that's on edge, still reeling from the war's impact. And, in that kind of environment, fear and suspicion can run rampant.
Oh, absolutely.
Wouldn't be surprising if people were quick to jump to conclusions, seeing threats where there might be none.
Right.
But let's shift our focus back to the victims for a moment. The sources mention some pretty interesting details about the family dynamics at Hinterkaifeck. Andreas, the father, was apparently a rather strict and controlling figure.
Yes, he was.
Could there have been tensions within the family that might have contributed to what happened?
That's an excellent point. To understand a crime, we need to understand the context in which it occurred, and the family dynamics at Hinterkaifeck were, to put it mildly, complex.
Right.
Andreas was known to be a stern disciplinarian, and there were rumors of him being abusive towards his wife and daughter.
And then there's the question of little Joseph's paternity.
Right.
The sources suggest that Victoria might have had a relationship with Lorenz Schlittenbauer before the war, and Joseph could have been his son.
That's right. And in 1922, that kind of thing was a huge scandal.
Yeah.
Imagine the pressure Victoria must have felt being a young widow in a rural community with whispers swirling about her child's legitimacy.
Yeah.
It's not hard to imagine that these tensions might have boiled over into conflict, perhaps even violence.
So we're looking at a family potentially riddled with secrets and resentments, living in a time of great societal upheaval. It sounds like the perfect recipe for disaster. And then to add another layer of complexity, you have Maria, the new maid.
Right.
She'd only been at the farm for a few days before the murders. Do we know anything about her background or her possible involvement?
Unfortunately, Maria remains one of the biggest mysteries in this case. We know very little about her, where she came from, or why she chose to work at such an isolated farm. Could she have been an innocent bystander caught in a web of violence, or did she bring her own secrets and motivations to Hinterkaifeck?
It's fascinating to think about. Was she a witness to something she shouldn't have seen, or was she perhaps more deeply entangled in the events than we realize? It seems like every new detail we uncover just adds to the enigma. But let's talk about the crime itself for a moment. The sources point out that whoever committed these murders seemed to have a very intimate knowledge of the farm layout and the family's routine.
That's one of the most unsettling aspects of this case.
Yeah.
The killer didn't just barge in and attack randomly. They seemed to know exactly where to find the victims, how to navigate the farm buildings, even where to conceal the bodies. It suggests someone who had been there before, someone who had observed the family, perhaps even planned the attack in advance.
And that brings us back to our list of suspects. Could it have been Carl lurking in the shadows, waiting to exact his revenge, or Lorenz driven to madness by jealousy, or maybe even the Gumberker brothers seeking retribution for past wrongs?
Each theory has its strengths and weaknesses, and that's the frustrating brilliance of the Hinterkaifeck case.
Yeah.
The evidence exists, but it's fragmented, open to interpretation.
It's like a giant jigsaw puzzle with crucial pieces missing. And without those pieces, we're left to fill in the gaps with our own imaginations, our own interpretations of the clues that remain.
And that's precisely what has kept people fascinated by this case for over a century. We're drawn to the unknown, to the challenge of trying to solve a puzzle that seems impossible to solve.
You know, as we've been talking about all these different theories, I can't help but think about the psychological aspect of this crime. What kind of mind could conceive of such a brutal act and then carry it out with such seeming precision?
That's a question that has haunted investigators and, armchair detectives for generations. Was this a crime of passion, a sudden eruption of rage? Or was it a meticulously planned act of vengeance? Carried out with cold-blooded determination, the sources we've looked at offer some intriguing insights into the killer's possible mindset. For example, the choice of weapon, the mattock, is particularly interesting.
Oh, in what way?
Well, it wasn't just any sharp object. It was a tool that was associated with the farm itself, a symbol of everyday life at Hinterkaifeck.
Right.
Using it as a murder weapon suggests a level of familiarity, perhaps even a desire to defile a place that held some significance for the killer.
That's a really disturbing thought. It's almost like they wanted to not only destroy the family, but also the very essence of their world, and the way some of the bodies were concealed almost ritualistically adds to that sense of something deeper, something more symbolic at play.
You're right. It wasn't just about killing. It was about control, about leaving a very specific message. But what was that message and who was it intended for? Those are the questions we may never be able to answer definitively.
It's almost as if the killer wanted to erase this family, wipe them from existence, and yet, paradoxically, the brutality of the crime ensures that their memory will live on forever, entwined with this unsolved mystery.
Exactly. The very act of trying to silence them has amplified their story, made it resonate across time, and perhaps that's part of the reason why we're still so captivated by Hinterkaifeck, even after all these years.
Yeah, it's a reminder that some stories, they just refuse to be forgotten, that some questions demand to be asked, even if the answers remain elusive. So as we reach the end of our deep dive, I'm left with a sense of awe, but also a profound sadness. 6 lives were brutally cut short, and the truth of what happened that night may never be fully known.
And yet I think there's value in exploring these mysteries, and grappling with the uncomfortable questions they raise about human nature, about the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of even the most seemingly peaceful communities.
Absolutely. The Hinterkaifeck case reminds us that the past is never truly past, that its echoes continue to shape our present. And maybe by engaging with these stories, by seeking to understand them, we can find a way to navigate the shadows of our own time.
So as we conclude this deep dive, I want to leave you with this thought. Imagine yourself back in 1922, standing on the threshold of that isolated farmhouse, the Bavarian countryside, stretching out before you. What do you see? What do you feel? And most importantly, what conclusions do you draw from the evidence we've explored? The answers, my friend, are for you to ponder.
That's a great note to end on. The Hinterkaifeck murders remain a puzzle, a challenge to our understanding of the world. But as we've seen, even in the absence of definitive answers, the process of inquiry, of seeking truth, can be its own reward. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those minds open.